The station smelled like recycled air, ozone, and bad coffee. It always had. Admiral Sarah Voss had spent 31 years breathing that metallic, stale atmosphere, and she had long ago stopped noticing the sharp, chemical scent that clung to every bulkhead in uniform. What she noticed now was the document on her screen. 3 pages. Standard format. The Consortium golden sunburst emblem sat at the top, a mocking symbol of celestial authority. It was printed in an iridescent ink that cost more than a Terran engineer made in an entire month of grueling shifts in the asteroid mines. It was a formal notification of a boundary crossing. Another one. Voss read it twice, her eyes tracking the cold, clinical language of the alien bureaucrats who looked at humanity and saw only a minor inconvenience. Then she signed it with a hand that didn't tremble, though her heart felt heavy as lead. The protest was filed at 0600 station time. It was the same as the last one. It was the same as the 14 protests before that. Voss knew exactly what would happen next. The Consortium would receive it with a polite, automated nod. They would stamp it with their digital seal of indifference. They would drop it into a massive, bottomless database somewhere in the bureaucratic belly of their capital station, and they would forget it even existed before the next shift began. This was diplomacy as the galaxy understood it. It was a grand, hollow performance that everyone attended, but no one actually believed in, a dance of ghosts in the void. Voss set the stylus down and looked out the reinforced viewport. Outside, the earth turned in a slow, majestic crawl of blue and white. It was beautiful, slow, and utterly indifferent to the politics of the species that called it home. She had grown up watching it from this very station, a small girl staring at the clouds while her father worked the comms. Her son had watched it too, his nose pressed against the same glass. He had spent 8 years up here before the Kepler posting, before the reassignment that tore their family apart, before she had stopped looking at the viewport for pleasure and started looking at it as a battlefield. Her aide, Lieutenant Mako, stood at the door. He was young, sharp, and carried the kind of face that had not yet learned the heavy art of hiding what it was thinking. Right now, his eyes were shadowed, and he was thinking she looked like a woman who hadn't slept since the last decade. He was right. She was exhausted down to her marrow. "They have confirmed the patrol route," she said, her voice sounding like dry parchment. Mako nodded, his posture stiffening. 3 Velhari Dreadnoughts, Admiral. Class A juggernauts. They crossed the pale boundary at 0430. No intent filing with Terran authority. No communication at all. They didn't even acknowledge our hails. Voss stood up, her joints popping with a sound that seemed loud in the quiet office. Her knees did not hurt the way they used to. The station medical bay had done something about that last year, some bioregenerative procedure involving nanites that she had not asked questions about. She hadn't wanted to hear the answers. She was 54. The station was 54. They were the same age, she and this aging piece of floating metal. Some days, she thought they were equally tired of holding themselves together against the crushing vacuum. "Where are they headed?" she asked, moving toward the primary terminal. Mako adjusted the holographic display, and a map of the sector bloomed in the air. "The projected course puts them directly over the Mirror colony by 1400, he said. Mirror. The word tasted like copper in her mouth. 50,000 people lived there. They were farmers, mostly, working the lunar soil under massive, fragile domes. It was a biodome agriculture hub that supplied food to 3 other colony systems, the lifeblood of the human frontier. The colony had been there for 60 years, built by people who had scraped together every scrap of metal and oxygen the Consortium would allow them to have. No FTL drives were permitted. No exotic energy systems. Nothing that might make a human colony feel too permanent or too real. The Consortium wanted humanity to remain a holding pattern, a species in transit that never arrived. Having Velhari Dreadnoughts pass over Mirror at low orbit was not an accident or a navigational error. Nothing the Consortium did was an accident. It was a message whispered in the language of sheer power. We are here. We are large. Sign the treaty. The treaty in question was a resource extraction agreement that was little more than legalized theft. Consortium corporations wanted the asteroid belts. They wanted the ores that humans had bled for. The UN Terran Authority had been stalling for 8 months, playing the diplomatic game as well as a species 300 years behind the technological curve could manage. But the dreadnoughts were the Consortium clearing its throat, preparing to scream. Voss walked to the tactical display, her eyes narrowing as she watched 3 red markers move in slow, arrogant formation across the projected map. They were vast, miles of obsidian black hull and plasma shielding. They moved with the unhurried grace of predators who knew there were no other wolves in the forest. She studied the route for a long moment, the silence of the room pressing in on her like deep-sea pressure. "Get me Ganymede Station on the secure channel," she said, her voice dropping an octave. Mako's face did that careful, twitchy thing it did when he was mentally sorting through a dozen different ways to ask a dangerous question. "Which channel, Admiral?" he whispered. "You know which one, run," she replied, looking him dead in the eye. He left without another word, his boots clicking rhythmically on the deck plates. It had taken him 2 years to stop looking surprised when she said things like that, but the fear was still there, buried under the training. Voss looked at the red markers again. The Velhari had catalogued everything they could see from their high towers. They knew the ship counts of the Terran fleet, pitiful things powered by chemical rockets. They knew the armament assessments, primitive missiles and short-range lasers. They had rated humanity's military capacity as negligible. Fission reactors. Chemical propellants. No exotic physics. They were not wrong about what they had seen through their long-range sensors. They just had not seen everything. They hadn't looked into the shadows of the lunar craters or the hollowed-out hearts of the asteroids. The secure channel opened with a burst of static that sounded like a grinding saw, then settled into the clean, eerie silence of a properly shielded quantum mine. The voice that came through belonged to Director Hollis Crane. He was 70 years old and sounded like gravel being shaken in a tin can. He had the temperament of a man who had spent his life looking at blueprints and expecting the universe to fail him. "Admiral, Director?" Voss asked, her voice a low hum. "Status?" Crane responded in a tone so flat it was almost mechanical. 87 arrays at full charge, Sarah. 41 operational, 46 on reserve cycle. We're holding the line. Ganymede primary lance is at 98.4%. The colony arrays are all green. We have been green for 11 days. 11 days. Voss had not slept well in 11 days. She had spent them staring at the ceiling of her quarters, imagining the sound of those massive alien engines overhead. She thought about the Mirror Ridge installation. It had come online 6 weeks ahead of schedule, a feat of engineering that defied every projection the UN had made. Something that might have been pride, or perhaps just grim satisfaction, came from Crane. "Your daughter-in-law's engineering team did the final calibration," he added. Voss said nothing for a long heartbeat. Her daughter-in-law, Lena, had poured her grief into blueprints. She had spent decades in sealed underground facilities that appeared on no Consortium map, working in the dark. Lena had never once said the word Kepler to her since the day the colony fell. She did not need to. The memory of 60,000 people starving behind a blockade was etched into every rivet and every line of code in the machinery they had built. "Tell me the lances are ready," Voss said. It was not a question. She had known they were ready since the last live-fire simulation in the shadow of Jupiter. She said it because it was a ritual of faith. It was the way a soldier checks the safety on a rifle they've carried for 1,000 miles. "They are ready, Admiral," Crane confirmed, his voice finally showing a hint of the weight he carried. Voss exhaled slowly, her breath hitching slightly. Outside the viewport, the Velhari Dreadnoughts continued their slow, oppressive arc toward Mirror Colony. They moved like they owned the space they occupied, like they owned the very air the colonists breathed. For 211 years, they had been the undisputed masters of the dark. Humanity had been classified as a protected developing species, a polite way of saying they were prisoners in their own star system. Humanity was placed behind a line called the Pale for its own good. It was like a fence around something fragile. Or something dangerous. The Consortium was never quite sure which one humans were, so they treated them like both. Voss had read the original quarantine documents. Unpredictable behavioral patterns, the alien scholars had written. Accelerated technological development. Recommend containment pending further study. Containment had led to the tragedy of Kepler. Containment had led to 60,000 people dying in the dark while the galaxy watched and called it a lesson in humility. Voss picked up the signed protest document again. 3 pages of standard format. The right words arranged in the right useless order, typed in a font that screamed of bureaucratic civility. She set it back down. Her grandfather had been a mechanical engineer back when the first colonies were just tin cans on the moon. The family line went back through ordinary work, oily hands, and quiet lives. None of them had been soldiers. But her grandfather had been the first to write down the thought experiment on the back of a greasy supply invoice in a machine shop that smelled of WD-40. He had run out of proper paper, but the idea would not wait for a fresh pad. Just physics. Just a simple question of momentum. What happened if you accelerated a dense object to a fraction of light speed using nothing but electromagnetic force? No exotic fuels. No illegal FTL tech. Just current, copper rails, and the fundamental laws of a universe that belonged to everyone. The math was simple. It had always been simple. That was the thing the Consortium did not understand about the human heart. Humans had not invented the physics. The physics was a gift from the cosmos. Humans had just been angry enough to master it while locked in a cage. Mako reappeared at the door, his face pale under the sterile LED lights. The Velhari patrol has made contact with Mirror Colony Traffic Control, he reported. They have declared a standard navigation survey approach. They're ignoring our sovereign airspace. Navigation survey. Voss almost smiled, a cold, sharp expression that didn't reach her eyes. Of course they did. They're coming in low to rattle the windows. Is there anything I should prepare for, Admiral? Mako asked. He was trying to ask the real question, the one that would change the course of history, without actually saying the words that would make it real. Voss looked at him. He was 23. His mother was a hydroponics farmer on a station not unlike this one. His father taught math to children who had never seen a real forest. He had joined the fleet because he believed in the promise of a united humanity. She had believed once, too. She still did, just with a much darker perspective. Yes, she said. Prepare a formal protest document. Unauthorized boundary crossing. Make it thorough, correct, and utterly standard. A pause that stretched until the air felt thick. And after that, open a channel to Mirror Colony Ridge Operations Center. Mako understood then. She could see the realization hit him like a physical blow. He was young, but he was a child of the Pale. He knew what happened when the giants came to visit. He left to fulfill the order. Voss turned back to the viewport. Humans had stared at the stars for 100,000 years before reaching them. They had always understood the universe was enormous and they were small. If you were in this situation, standing on the edge of a war that has been brewing for centuries, what would you do? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, drop a like. It really helps. Part 2. High Arbiter Thesaven Kale was 340 years old, and he was profoundly bored. He stood on the vast, pristine observation deck of the Velhari Dreadnought, Time's sovereign reach. The room was a wide, curved cathedral of glass and black metal, designed with a single purpose, to make whoever stood in it feel the appropriate size. Small. Aware of the ship around them. Aware of the ship's absolute power and the ancient empire that had forged it. Kale had stood in rooms like this for over 2 centuries. He no longer felt small in them. He felt the weight of routine, the crushing boredom of a man who had seen every corner of a galaxy he believed was fully tamed. Below the viewport, the human colony of Mirror spread across the surface of the planet like a stain that had somehow learned the art of organization. He saw the clusters of low, functional buildings and the sprawling green circles of the biodomes. All of it was contained neatly within the pale, like a specimen under glass. All of it was manageable. To Kale, manageable was the highest condition of safety for everyone involved. Humans were, according to every official document he had ever read, difficult. Their behavioral patterns were erratic and violent. Their rate of technological development, when left unsupervised, outpaced their social and political maturity by a frightening margin. The quarantine had been a reasonable, even compassionate solution to a real problem. It had been in place for 211 years. It had worked. Humans were still here, still breathing, which was more than some species in their position had managed. His intelligence officer, a young Velhari named Sarah who still smelled of the academy, stood to his right. He was holding a data tablet with the stiff-backed posture of someone who thought every procedural detail was a matter of life and death. "High Arbiter, the standard threat assessment as you requested," Sarah said. Kale had not actually requested it, it was standing procedure, but Sarah was new and eager to prove his diligence. "Go ahead," Kale sighed, his eyes tracking a cloud formation over the human colony. "Terran Defense Fleet consists of 43 primary vessels," Sarah read, his voice clear and confident. "All are classified as light military by our standards. Primary armament is chemical propellant kinetic weaponry, slug throwers. Their hull penetration risk to a Velhari Dreadnought class is negligible. Maximum effective range against our shielding configuration is also negligible. Maximum speed?" Kale asked, though he already knew the answer. "FTL capability is 0, Sarah confirmed. They have no functional FTL drives and no licensed access to the technology. Their energy weapon systems are fission-based and haven't seen a yield increase in nearly 2 decades. No meaningful advances, High Arbiter." Kale looked down at the colony again. A small vehicle moved along one of the flat, dusty roads, a tiny dot of life in a vast, gray landscape. He watched it until it became too small to track. "And the population?" he asked. "Mirror Colony has approximately 52,000 registered residents," Sarah replied, scrolling through his tablet. "Primary economic activity is agricultural production, food for the other Terran systems." It was a closed loop, Kale noted. The Consortium's trade restrictions kept human commerce internal, making them dependent on each other while the rest of the galaxy moved on. The Pale was generous enough to allow a functioning economy, but it was not generous enough to allow the birth of a real power. That was the delicate balance Kale had spent 40 years maintaining. He considered it one of the better things he had done in a long life of service. "The treaty situation?" he asked. "The UN Terran Authority has declined to advance negotiations for the 8th consecutive month," Sarah said, his voice tightening. "They cite environmental concerns and revenue-sharing issues." "Their real objection?" Kale pushed. Sarah hesitated, searching for a diplomatic answer. "Unclear, High Arbiter. Perhaps they simply hope we will go away." Kale knew what the real objection was. The humans were smart enough to know they were being cheated, but they were not strong enough to do anything about it. They were stalling because it was the only power they had left. Eventually, the math of survival would force them to sign. The presence of 3 dreadnoughts in their sky was just a way to speed up the calculation. "Take us into low orbit," Kale ordered. "Standard demonstration profile. Let them see the hulls. Let them feel the shadow." The Time Sovereign Reach adjusted its course with a silent, powerful rumble. The other 2 dreadnoughts followed in a perfect, intimidating formation. They moved with the terrifying gravity of things that had no reason to hurry. Kale watched the planet grow larger in the viewport until it filled his entire vision. Mirror Colony's traffic control center had made contact at the standard point, offering the usual greetings in standard Velhari diplomatic form. The human controller had been polite, professional, and entirely powerless. He had asked about the nature of the visit, and a navigation survey declaration had been filed in response. It was technically true, they were surveying the limits of human patience. Cale found himself thinking, not for the first time, that humans were surprisingly adaptable. Whatever else you said about them, and a great deal was said in the backrooms of the capital, they were survivors. They had taken their quarantine and built a world inside it. They had engineering programs, schools, and cities on barren moons. They hadn't collapsed into civil war or despair as the early models had predicted. Cale had written a paper about this resilience long ago. He had called it a warning, but the politicians had seen it as a curiosity. He had filed that paper in his memory with a kind of sad precision. "We are at optimal demonstration altitude," his navigation officer reported. Below them, the individual shapes of the colony buildings were close enough to see the shadows they cast. The biodomes were enormous, catching the sun like giant, crystalline eyes. Somewhere in the colony's comms, the formal protest from Earth would be arriving. It would be correctly worded, correctly filed, and precisely useless. Cale was prepared for that. He was prepared for the standard cycle of imperial dominance. He was not prepared for the sudden shift in his tactical officer's voice. "High Arbiter," the officer said, his tone sharp enough to cut through Cale's boredom. "There is a structural feature on the colony's equatorial ridge that is not in our survey records." Cale turned, his interest finally peaked. "Show me." The tactical display shifted, bringing up a magnified image of the ridge line. He saw a series of large, cylindrical structures made of a dull, gray alloy. They were spaced evenly along the high ground, connected by massive infrastructure conduits and support frames. The whole arrangement ran for several kilometers. "Industrial facilities?" Cale asked, his brow furrowing. The tactical officer didn't look convinced. "The construction style is Terran, but there are no energy signatures. No heat blooms. No radiation. They're just sitting there." "How long have they been there?" Cale asked. Sarah checked the archives. "The last formal survey of Mirror was 11 years ago," he said. "These structures were not present then." 11 years. It was a blink of an eye for a Velhari, but for a human, it was a lifetime of construction. Cale looked at the cylinders again. They were long, aligned in a sequence, and tilted upward at a specific, 40-degree angle. He wasn't a weapons engineer, but a cold feeling began to stir in his gut. His science attaché, a young woman named Driva who had the habit of reading everything she could find, spoke from the back of the room. "High Arbiter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Those cylinders, they are aligned to feed into each other. If you follow the line of their orientation, they are bearing directly toward our current orbital position." The observation deck went into a state of absolute, ringing stillness. It was the silence of people realizing they had walked into a room and found a gun pointed at their chest. Cale didn't move. He looked at the display. 3 dreadnoughts, sitting like ducks in low orbit. "What are they?" he whispered. "I do not know," Driva replied. "There is no energy signature. No power bloom. Our sensors can't categorize them because they aren't doing anything. They're just waiting." Unknown things could be nothing. In Cale's experience, unknown things were usually nothing. Sarah's assessment was probably right, these were likely just industrial pipes for some new mining project. But the silence coming from the ridge was deafening. It was the first time in a very long time that Cale felt a prickle of genuine, cold caution. "Begin approach withdrawal," he said, his voice firm. His navigation officer looked back, startled. "High Arbiter. We haven't even completed the demonstration." "I said begin withdrawal," Cale repeated, his eyes fixed on the display. He watched the cylinders. They didn't move. They sat there in the afternoon light, silent and gray. And then, the communications officer spoke. "High Arbiter, an incoming transmission from the colony surface." Addressed to us directly. It's marked from the Ridge Operations Center. Kale turned. What does it say? The officer read it aloud. It was short. 3 sentences. A formal greeting in Velhari. A notification of the protest filed by Earth. And then the final sentence. The humans were requesting the Velhari patrol maintain its current altitude and heading for the next 4 minutes to allow for the safe completion of a routine technical calibration. Routine technical calibration. Kale looked at the cylinders again. They were pointing right at him. He didn't finish the thought. All ships, maximum withdrawal speed. Now. He shouted, but the time's sovereign reach was a mountain of metal. It moved with power, but not with speed. And the 4 minutes were already ticking away. Part 3 that the tactical room on Voss's station had a specific smell. It was the sharp, metallic tang of equipment running at 110% capacity and the stifling silence of 40 people who all understood that they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Voss had been in the room for 6 hours, her eyes never leaving the main tactical grid. Mako was at the communication station, his fingers hovering over the keys. The targeting systems team, 4 people who had spent 11 years of their lives learning how to operate equipment that officially didn't exist, sat in a row along the far wall. Their eyes were locked on their individual screens, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of the targeting software. Nobody sat the way people sit when they are relaxed. The Velhari patrol had started to withdraw 11 minutes ago. Kale had ordered it, sensing the trap, but Voss didn't care why he was running. What she cared about was the geometry of the shot. The targeting solution on her display was a complex web of numbers, arcs, and projected intercept vectors. The 3 dreadnoughts were massive, slow to maneuver, and built for a kind of warfare that involved shields and plasma fire. They were not built for a threat that arrived from a planetary surface at 4% the speed of light with no warning and no energy signature. Director Crane's voice came through the secure channel, sounding more like a recording than a man. Ganymede Lance is holding at 100%, he reported. Mirror Ridge sequence is locked. All 87 arrays are synced. We are waiting on your order, Admiral. Voss looked at the display. The 3 red icons were moving, trying to put distance between themselves and the colony. The Times-honored doctrine was the target in the center of the formation. She was not going to destroy them. That had never been the objective. The plan was to perform a demonstration that would echo across the galaxy. 1 shot. 3 rods. Kinetic energy measured in numbers that usually described the birth of stars. The math was the message. She had spent a year making sure the logic was inescapable. Solution received, Crane confirmed. Target vectors are intercept, not direct. Confirming non-impact solution for all 3 vessels. We're going to brush their teeth, Admiral. Voss looked at the countdown. 40 seconds. She had 40 seconds to decide if 200 years of silent, furious engineering was worth the risk of a total war. She thought of the 60,000 at Kepler, the faces of the children she had seen in the reports, the hollow eyes of the survivors. Her brain tried to simplify the number to protect her, but she pushed back. 60,000. It was a number you had to feel. Authorized firing sequence, she said, her voice echoing in the silent room. Authorization Voss Sierra 7. Authorization confirmed, Crane replied. His voice held no triumph, only a grim, professional weight. Lance sequence armed. 28 seconds to the firing window. Voss watched the red shapes on the display. They were burning their engines now, but they were trying to move a mountain with a candle. 10 seconds. Voss thought about her grandfather's supply invoice, the one with the equations scrawled on the back in oil-stained ink. She had it framed in her quarters, though the ink was fading. The equations were simple. High school physics. F equals ma. Kinetic energy equals half the mass times the velocity squared. The same physics taught to children on every world in the Consortium. Because the universe ran on the same laws everywhere, and those laws didn't care about who held the most territory. 5. 4. 3. 2. She didn't close her eyes. The lance fired. There was no sound on the station, only a deep, sub-vocal hum that vibrated in her teeth. Back in the early days of sci-fi, people had imagined railguns as loud, booming cannons. But the Ganymede Lance was quiet, a massive electromagnetic pulse that her instruments recorded as a spike in the grid. And then the rods were gone, moving too fast for any human eye to track. The rods crossed the pale boundary at second 3. The Dreadnought sensors would be screaming now, if they could even figure out what to scream about. No energy signature. No heat. Just mass arriving at a velocity that defied every defensive protocol the Velhari had ever written. Her analysts had predicted the aliens would have 0.4 seconds to react. You cannot maneuver a miles-long dreadnought in 0.4 seconds. The first and third rods passed through their intercept vectors with terrifying precision. They passed through empty space exactly as calculated, centimeters from the alien hulls. The kinetic disturbance of passing mass at that speed would have registered as a tectonic shift on the dreadnought's hulls. It was a warning shot that bypassed every shield they had, but the second rod encountered a variable the math hadn't accounted for: panic. The captain of the Times-honored doctrine had received Kale's order and then the 0.4 sensor alarm. He had frozen for a fraction of a second, then burned his maneuvering thrusters in the wrong direction. He moved the ship not away from the intercept, but slightly into it. The tungsten composite rod did not destroy the dreadnought. It didn't have to. At 4% light speed, the rod removed the forward port quarter of the ship as if it were made of wet paper. Weapon systems, sensor arrays, and crew deck simply ceased to exist. They were converted into a debris field that continued on its own trajectory, silent and cold. Voss watched the icon on her display change shape as the damage reports began to flood the emergency channels. "Damage report is coming in," Mako said, his voice trembling slightly. "The Times-honored doctrine is still mobile. Life support in the main hull is holding." "Casualties?" Voss asked. Mako was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the alien comms. 11 crew, he said. Voss closed her eyes for 2 seconds. 11. It was not 60,000, but it was 11 people who had woken up that morning expecting a routine patrol. She held that number in her mind until it was the right size, then she set it down next to the memory of Kepler. "Send the treaty counterproposal," she ordered. "The version with the oversight clauses. And send a formal expression of regret for the navigational incident." Mako paused. "Regret?" "Yes," Voss said. She meant it. She regretted that they had moved. She regretted the deaths. But she also meant the treaty. Because now, for the first time in 2 centuries, the Consortium would finally be willing to read it. Part 4. The emergency broadcast went out on 17 frequencies simultaneously, a frantic digital scream across the sector. High Arbiter Kale sent it personally from his command chair, bypassing the usual staff protocols. He sent it because he knew that every intelligence director and military commander in the Consortium needed to see the data before they had time to form a lie. The Times-honored doctrine was trailing behind them, bleeding atmosphere and debris from the jagged hole where its forward section used to be. By the time they cleared the mirror system, Kale had 47 responses in his queue. He ignored them all. He called Driva into his study, the young woman who had seen the trap before anyone else. She came in clutching her data tablet as if it were a shield. "Sit," he said. "What did we actually see?" "Give me the physics. .3 kinetic impactors, solid tungsten composite," Driva said, her voice shaking but her mind clear. "We captured the spectroscopy from the debris cloud. Mass is 17,000 kilograms per unit. Impact velocity was 4.2% of light speed." Kale did the math again in his head. He had to. Numbers that large felt like a mistake, a glitch in the universe. Each of those rods carried the kinetic energy of a tactical nuclear warhead, but with none of the fallout and no way to intercept them. No exotic tech. No illegal research. Just raw mass and sheer velocity. The humans had turned the vacuum of space into a firing range. Where were they fired from? Kale asked, though he already knew. Mirror Colony Ridge, Driva replied. The cylinders we saw. They're magnetic rails. How long has that installation been there? Kale pushed. Driva hesitated, her fingers dancing over the tablet. The mirror installation was started 41 years ago. But High Arbiter, it's not the only one. She turned the tablet to face him, showing a map of the Pale. It was covered in red dots. Across 17 systems, there were anomalies that the Consortium had ignored for a century. Power patterns that looked like industrial mining. Geological surveys that were flagged as mining shafts. Looked at individually, they were boring. Looked at together, they were a constellation of defiance. The oldest facility, on Ganymede, showed construction that began 207 years ago. Just 11 years after we put them in the cage, Kale felt a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. 80 or 90 installations, Driva whispered. All built using standard, legal industrial equipment. All capable of reaching any point in human space and far beyond. Why did no one see this? Kale asked, his voice a low growl. Because we weren't looking for a spear, Driva said. We were looking for a high-tech sword. We looked for things we understood. We didn't look for kinetic mass drivers because we consider them primitive technology. We moved past it 600 years ago. We assumed they were too backwards to be a threat. And they used that assumption as a cloak. The humans had not moved past the stone and the sling, they had simply made the sling miles long. There was nothing else for them to work on. All the other paths, FTL, exotic particles, were blocked by treaty. Kale thought of the cage he had so carefully maintained. He had built it to keep them safe and small. But in doing so, he had forced them to master the only weapon that couldn't be banned, the laws of motion. He stood up and walked to the viewport. The stars were there, silent and ancient. The Pale was just a line on a map, a line that had been shattered this afternoon. He thought of Kepler. He had ordered that blockade to teach them a lesson about imperial authority. 60,000 people. He had weighed it against the stability of the sector and decided the lesson was worth the cost that he sat at his desk and pulled up the human protest from 162 years ago. He read it again, his eyes lingering on a paragraph he had once dismissed as empty rhetoric. The Terran Authority formally requests the right to maintain defensive systems proportionate to demonstrated threats, it said. He looked at the map again. They had given the Consortium formal notice. They had followed every rule. And then they had started building. They hadn't lied. They had just been ignored. Kale realized then that the Consortium hadn't been outsmarted by a superior mind. They had been blinded by their own comfort. They assumed the smaller thing was manageable because it was in a box. But the box had been full of teeth for a very long time. Part 5.6 months after the shot that changed the galaxy, it rained in Geneva. It was a persistent, melancholy rain that turned the lake into a sheet of slate. Admiral Voss stood at the window of the UN building, watching the water ripple. She had a cup of coffee that had gone stone cold. Behind her, her negotiating team was going over the final briefing materials for the third time in 2 hours. They were waiting for the emperors. In the last 6 months, the Consortium had been in a state of quiet, panicked shock. They had commissioned reports, fired intelligence directors, and halted all expansion near the Pale. The mining corporations were screaming about lost revenue, but the military was staying very, very far away from the human border. The delegation had arrived last night. 7 emperors. A security detail that could have conquered a planet. Kale was leading them. Voss had read his messages over the last few months. They were not warm, but they were honest. He was a man who had realized he was standing on a landmine and was trying to figure out how to step off. The protocol officer opened the session with 7 minutes of formal, ancient language. It was a way to stall, to give the emperors time to look at the humans without having to speak. Then the Marathian emperor spoke for the group. He was small and polite, his voice a melodic hum. The mirror incident was regrettable, he said. A navigational error. The consortium wished to discuss modifications to the Pale. Voss listened, her face a mask of iron. She knew what he was trying to say without saying it. He was trying to say that the math of power had changed, and they were forced to acknowledge it. When he finished, there was a long, respectful pause. It was a courtesy that felt like a threat. Voss looked at the 7 emperors. Then she looked at Kale. "Thank you for the statement," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "High Arbiter, you want to know how many installations there are?" The room went so silent you could hear the rain hitting the glass. Kale met her gaze. He didn't look at his colleagues. He responded to her directness. "Yes," he said. "That is the question that I am not going to tell you," Voss replied. The silence deepened, becoming heavy and suffocating. "What I will tell you," she continued, "is that we did not build them to use them. We built them so you would have to decide." "Decide what?" Kale asked, leaning forward. "Whether to let us out," Voss said. "For 211 years, you made every decision for us. You drew the lines. You decided who we could talk to. You took that choice from us. We simply took it back." She put her hands flat on the table, a solid, grounded gesture. "We didn't want a war. We wanted a seat. The treaty counterproposal we sent is real. Every word of it." Part 6. Kale spoke next, his voice low. "You filed a notice," he said. 162 years ago. Voss nodded. "A notice that we intended to develop defensive systems. You archived it." He sat with that for a moment, the weight of a century of arrogance pressing down on him. 162 years of building in the dark. How many people knew? He asked. On your side. Voss thought of her grandfather. It wasn't a secret kept by spies in trench coats. It was a knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, from teacher to student. A trade that wasn't finished. A promise to a future that didn't involve a cage. "Enough people," she said. Kale looked at her, and for a moment, she saw the man behind the rank. A man who had just realized his entire life's work was based on a lie. "That I ordered the Kepler blockade," he said. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer an excuse. He simply owned the fact. It was the most honest thing any alien had ever said to her. "I know," Voss replied. "I have the files." "What do you want?" Kale asked, stripping away the last of the diplomatic veneer. "What does 2 centuries of being trapped produce in a species like yours?" "Membership," Voss said, her voice like a hammer. "Full consortium membership. A seat on the council. Removal of the Pale. Trade access on equal terms. We want to be part of the galaxy, not its pets." And, she added, a conversation about Kepler that does not use the word lesson. Kale was still. He looked at the other emperors, and she watched the compact calculate the cost of peace. They had come here to offer crumbs. They hadn't come to offer the whole loaf. But they also didn't know the number. The uncertainty was the real weapon. A cage full of hidden cannons you can't count is not a cage anymore, it's a stalemate. And in a stalemate, the side with the most to lose always blinks first. Kale spoke again, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "The compact will require formal sessions," he said. "There are procedures for membership." "We know the procedures," Voss said. "We have been studying them for 200 years while we waited for you to notice us." Something that wasn't quite a smile touched Kale's face. "I expect you have," he said. The session continued for 4 more hours, but the air had changed. The tension was still there, but it was the tension of a building being framed, not one being torn down. When the session finally closed and the emperors filed out, Kale was the last to leave the table. He stood by the window for a long time, looking at the gray, rain-slicked city. "The paragraph in the Kepler protest," he said, his back to her. "I read it when it was filed. I thought it was just words." "I know," Voss replied. "We knew you would. That's why we used them." He was quiet for a long beat. "You built it anyway. Even though we ignored you." "Yes," she said. "Especially because you ignored us." He looked at the window, at the people moving below under their umbrellas. 162 years of silence, he whispered. He walked toward the door, then stopped. "The installations," he said, still not turning. "The ones in the unsurveyed systems. The ones we don't have a number for. Are they real, Sarah?" Voss looked at his back, at the gray uniform of his rank. "Interesting question," she said, her voice neutral. He left without another word. Part 7. Mako appeared at her shoulder as the door clicked shut. "Was that a yes?" he whispered, his eyes wide. Voss picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, and set it down for the last time. "Walk with me, run," she said. They walked out of the room together, their boots echoing on the polished stone floors. They moved toward the building's front entrance, where the sound of the rain was getting louder. She didn't answer his question. She didn't need to. Mako was young, but he had spent 2 years watching her, and he was beginning to understand that some truths were more powerful when they were left unspoken. The ambiguity was what kept the peace. She thought about her grandfather's supply invoice. High school physics. Available to any species in the universe who had the patience to work through the equations. She thought about Lena, who was probably still at the Ridge Array, running diagnostic checks because the work never truly ended. She thought about the 60,000 who were gone and the 11 who had died on the alien ship. The space between those numbers was where the future had been forged. It was a space filled with grease, sweat, and a stubborn refusal to be small. Humanity had spent 200 years in a cage, but they had used that time to turn the bars into a ladder. She pushed open the heavy front door. The Geneva rain came down cold and clean, washing away the stale air of the assembly room. The universe is never truly hostile. It's never truly merciful, either. It's just present. It runs on the same rules everywhere, from the heart of a star to the streets of Switzerland. It offers the same equations to anyone brave enough to solve them. She stepped out into the rain and looked up. The sky was gray and heavy, the same sky she had seen 1,000 times. But tonight, for the first time in 211 years, the line someone else had drawn across it was gone. Humanity was no longer a specimen. They were just part of the stars. If you found this story powerful, please consider liking the video. It helps us bring more tales from the deep space to you. What would you have done if you were Voss? Let's discuss in the comments.